You think you know everything about Christmas? Well, think again, because Christmas is much older than you think. In fact, much older than Christianity itself. Let me tell you a secret. Jesus was not even born during the winter. He was born in the spring. And you know that modern image of Santa Claus that we like so much? Well, it comes from a Coca-Cola ad of the 1930s. So what do we celebrate on Christmas, really? In this video, I'm going to tell you the fascinating story of one of the oldest, most beautiful, biggest human celebrations in history, the story of Christmas. Our journey goes back to a time before cities, before nations, before religion itself, because Christmas existed way before Christmas. Take my hand. Let's go back in time 10,000 years ago. The Ice Age has ended. Humans have stopped being nomadic and are beginning to settle. Farming is emerging, and so understanding seasons is very important. Winter, among them, is the most dangerous season of all of them because cold kills, food runs out, and disease and darkness dominates. So people watch the sky very carefully. They don't have watches like you and me, but they build primitive calendars that track the sun and its shadow day by day. During winter, the sun stays lower in the sky, and so the midday shadow grows longer day by day. Winter deepens, but then one day something crucial happens. The sun begins rising higher in the midday, and its shadow stops growing and starts shrinking. The days become longer, and that is the signal. The signal that darkness has reached its limit and light will slowly return. For us, we call that basic astronomy, but for the ancients, this was survival. The winter solstice was not an abstract idea. It meant we made it. The worst is behind us. We are still alive. So humans did what humans do at turning points, which is they gathered, they lit fires, and they slaughtered animals that they could not afford to feed through the winter, and they feasted. They did a festival, a celebration. They stood close and warm, and so light, food, community, and hope, those are the first ingredients of what we will call later Christmas. And this matters a lot because this didn't happen in one culture or one region alone. It happened everywhere, across Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, in the Americas. Different peoples who had no contact with each other responded to the same moment in the same way. Darkness reaches its peak, light returns, and so before gods, before churches, before Christmas, before actually the Romans and before Christianity arrived, Christmas was simply a human response to the winter. Now let's move forward in time. Fast forward a few thousand years. We're still in winter, but now we are in Rome. Rome is not a small tribe anymore. It's millions of people. It's an empire of cities, of laws and armies. And Rome was obsessed with one thing: order, discipline, hierarchy, rules. Now I want you to picture this same Rome in December. It's the empire of laws facing the harshest side of nature. Romans needed a way to lift morale and release social pressure during the hardest months of the year. So they took those original and primitive winter celebrations that I was telling to you about and turned them into something official. And they called this Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a festival celebrated every December. It lasted several days, and the city turned into something Rome usually feared, which was chaos and fun. Work stopped, courts shut down, schools closed, and there were feasts in the streets, candles everywhere, and gifts were exchanged almost in a mandatory kind of way. And the most insane part? For a few days, the social order was flipped. Slaves could actually mock their masters, and masters behaved like slaves. People wore casual clothes instead of the formal togas that we're used to seeing, and excess was actually encouraged. Rome understood something that modern societies still apply, which is when hard times squeeze people, they need some sort of pressure valve or release, or they will cause trouble or a revolution. And so here's the important thing. Saturnalia did not erase the old winter rituals, it institutionalized them. Light, food, gifts, togetherness, the same ingredients as before, just scaled to the size of an empire. Rome did not invent Christmas, but it built the first version of a winter festival designed to spread. Official, popular, joyful, but then, in a corner of the empire, everything changed forever. We all know the basics of the next chapter of our story. In a remote corner of the empire, in a land called Judea, an extraordinary man was born. His name is Jesus. And let's be very clear about this. Jesus was a real historical person. This is non-controversial. Serious historians, both Christian and not Christian, agree 100% on this. We have Roman sources, we have Jewish sources, we have independent accounts of the life of Jesus. We know he existed, we know he was crucified, and we know that his teaching spread and changed the world. So the question is not so much who he was or what he did. The question is exactly when was he born? We know as a fact that the year is most likely wrong because our calendars were created centuries later. And so it contains errors, and most scholars agree today that most likely Jesus was born a few years earlier than what we call year zero. But what about the day? Well, most likely not December 25th. And let me tell you why. According to the Gospels, the shepherds were watching their flocks outdoors in the middle of the night. And we know from historical sources that in Judea, that did never happen during the winter. It's too cold. This happened in the spring, which means Jesus was most likely born when the weather was more mild, not in the cold of December, more around the months of what would be now April or May. And that's the key point, which is early Christians didn't really celebrate birthdays, so they didn't track when Jesus was born because they didn't care when he was born specifically, not Jesus, not anyone. For them, what mattered was not the birth date, it was the message and later the resurrection of Jesus. So, for the first centuries of Christianity, there was no Christmas, no December 25th, no nativity scenes. All those came later, much later, and when they did not appear in a vacuum. They appeared in a world that already knew how to celebrate winter, a world that already had lights, feasts, gifts, and hope in the darkest days of the year. And that's where our two stories, the Roman story and the Christian story, begin to merge. Now I want you to jump with me to the 4th century. Christianity is exploding and the Roman Empire is in turmoil and needs some sort of social glue. This change happened under one specific emperor called Constantine, helped quietly by his mother Helena, which was a devout Christian. Constantine did not invent Christianity. What he did is legalize it, protect it, and eventually promote it as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And by doing that, he gave Christianity something it had never had before, which is power. And once Christianity becomes public, it has a problem, which is that the empire already has a massive winter festival. In fact, several of them. We have spoken before about Saturnalia, but we have another festival called the celebration of the unconquered sun, Sol Invictus in Latin, which was celebrated specifically in December 25th. And that was the celebration of the winter solstice of the Romans. These two festivals are very loved, they're popular, they're deeply rooted into the Roman culture. And Constantine, of course, he can do many things. He can change laws, he can move armies, but there's one thing he will not do. He will never delete the empire's favorite winter celebration, because people can accept new laws, but they will never forgive you if you steal the reason of joy in the middle of the winter. So Christianity makes a genius move at this point. Instead of fighting the festival, it relabels that same festival. So the return of the sun, which is Sol Invictus in the Roman tradition, became the birth of Christ. Light defeating darkness got a new meaning, and December 25th wasn't chosen because it was historically accurate, because it wasn't, as we've seen. It was chosen just because people loved it, and so it wasn't really deception, it was an adaptation. It was a smart move where old rituals stood and a new theology was layered on top. And that's the moment when something really powerful happens, which is we take a human winter ritual, we layer on top a Christian celebration, and Christmas, the way we know it, is born. So now Christianity is spreading across Europe. But Europe is not empty. It's full of traditions, winter rituals, symbols, local myths, trees, winter spirits, lights, gift-giving. So trying to erase all of that would have failed the same way as the Romans avoided destroying Saturnalia. So people don't give up traditions that have helped them survive winter for generations. So Christianity did the same thing that had already done in Rome. It didn't destroy the winter cultures, it absorbed them. Old rituals were respected and new meanings were layered on top. That's how cultures actually spread. If something works, you don't fight it, you reinterpret it. And that's why Christmas doesn't feel 100% religious anymore. It feels familiar, human, because from this moment on, Christmas stops being just a religious date on a calendar. It becomes a container where different cultures pour their own symbols. And that's where things like Santa, trees, lights, and gifts all come from pagan traditions. And I'm gonna explain them to you now one by one, starting with the most famous one. Let's now talk about Santa Claus, because Santa is one of the strangest characters in human history. Santa feels ancient and at the same time he feels modern, and that's because he's a little bit of both. Our story is going to start in a place that people would never expect. Turkey. In the 4th century, there was a bishop there called Nicholas. He lived in a town called Myra, in which is now modern-day Turkey. He was a real person, and he was famous for one thing, his generosity. He secretly gave money to the poor, he helped children, he gave gifts anonymously, and after his death, actually, Nicholas became a saint, Saint Nicholas. And his story, of course, spread across Europe, for example. And as it spread, it started to change and mutate. In Northern Europe, St. Nicholas specifically merged with older winter figures. For example, they had bearded gods, winter spirits, and figures who watched children and traveled through the night sky. In fact, in Norse mythology, Odin was represented as a flying bearded god who rode through winter nights. Does it sound familiar? So, St. Nicholas slowly stopped being just a bishop from Turkey and he became something else, a winter gift giver, a moral judge, a magical figure. And then by the time this tradition of St. Nicholas reached the Netherlands, his name changed again. St. Nicholas became Sinterklaas. Centuries later, these same Dutch settlers came to America and they brought Sinterklaas with them, and his name changed a second time, and Sinterklaas became Santa Claus from Saint Nicholas. And now comes the fun part. For a long time, Santa Claus didn't look the way he does today. He was actually thin and skinny, sometimes scary, sometimes serious, and he was typically dressed in green because green is the color associated with nature. There was no standard Santa, but all of that changed in the 20th century. When mass media appears, one company more than other locked down the image of the official Santa. And that company was the Coca-Cola company. Coca-Cola did never invent Santa, but they defined him. The red suit, the white beard, the friendliness, the warmth, the safety. That is the Santa we all recognize today, that started as a Turkish bishop, then became a pagan winter spirit and global advertisement icon. It's not a corruption of Christmas. That's what Christmas always does, which is absorb things that already work and give them a new meaning. But Santa is just one of the many symbols of Christmas. Now, let's talk about the tree. When you think about Christmas, there's another symbol that feels almost as important as Santa, and that is the Christmas tree. And here's the surprising part. The Christmas tree is not Christian by origin, it's actually pre-Christian. Long before Christianity reached Northern Europe, people were already bringing evergreen trees into their home during the winter because these trees don't die in the colder months. And so, in a world where everything turns brown and lifeless, evergreens were perceived as a miracle, as the continuation of life. And that's the reason why the ancients brought evergreens into their homes as a sign of hope. Branches of these small trees were actually decorated with candles and fruit, typically apples, nuts, and berries. That was the symbol of life hanging on a tree that refused to die. But of course, apples, when you put them on a tree, they will slowly spoil and finally rot. So in the 18th and 19th century in Germany, real apples were replaced by glass ones that could last forever. And that is where the Christmas ornaments from the modern day come from. This one, in this case, is from plastic, but our Christmas balls today come from those glass apples in Germany, which comes from the fruit of these evergreen trees of the traditions of Northern Europe. Again, Christianity arrived later, and once again, it didn't fight, it didn't erase the symbol, it just gave it a new meaning. The evergreen tree becomes the eternal life, and the light becomes Christ, with the star as the light of the world. It's the same object with a new meaning, and the Christmas tree spreads just because it works. It's beautiful, it's something we can share, it's visual, it's warm. And sure, the candles from years ago became lights, the fire became electricity, but the emotion stays the same. So this is not theology, this is psychology. In the darkest time of the year, we decorate and we celebrate life. And just like Santa, the tree escapes religion. So now I'm going to talk about the question that everybody asks. Why does Christmas revolve around gifts? Well, we already know the tradition of Santa, of St. Nicholas, and why he brought gifts, and that's part of the answer. But Christianity has another gift story, and this one is actually even better. It's the story of the three kings celebrated in Spain and all of Latin America. If you read the scriptures, there's mentions of kings actually coming to celebrate the birth of Jesus, bringing gifts to the newborn child. But there's something most people don't even realize, that the story of the three kings barely exists in the Bible. If you're minimally religious, you'll know that there's 4 Gospels, right? Only one of the 4 Gospels actually mentions these 3 kings, and it only dedicates a few sentences to them. It actually never calls them kings, it calls them magi, which is the plural for magicians. And in that time, magician, it meant an astrologer or an astronomer from the East, in this case from Persia. The text never says how many there were, it doesn't call them kings, it doesn't even give them names. So everything else, the number, the crowns, the camels, the names, it came later, not from scripture, but from tradition. And here's the key insight. We don't give gifts because of the 3 kings. The 3 kings were developed because humans were already giving gifts in winter, and we needed some sort of religious cover to keep doing that same action. Gift giving, as we've seen, existed long before Christianity. It existed in Saturnalia, it existed in every pre-Christian winter ritual. Christianity did not invent the behavior, it explained it. It gave this ancient human instinct of gifting in the winter a story, and that's why both myths can coexist. And that's why gift giving became the emotional center of Christmas for believers, but also for everybody else. By now, one thing should be obvious. Christmas does not erase local culture. It absorbs it. Everywhere Christmas goes, it adapts, and that is the reason why Christmas looks a little bit different around the world. Different countries, they all have their own Christmas traditions, and some of them are quite wacky. And I'm going to share 3 of them to you now. The first one is actually from my land. As you know, I'm Spanish. I'm from a region called Catalonia. And here in Catalonia, we have this tradition called the cagatío. I'm going to show you what this is. So this is a tío. A tío, as you can see, it's actually a log, a log. And you know, kids, they paint a smiley face and they give them a hat. And so the legend goes that actually tíons like this, they come down from the forest in winter, and you need to keep them safe in your house during the Christmas season. And then what happens is that on Christmas Day, we cover them with a blanket, and then with sticks, we hit the tío and we sing a very, very famous song. And then when we do that, of course, the tío poops gifts, because the tío, caga tío, it means the pooping log. And that's a really true story. And that's a very common celebration here in my region, especially when you have young kids around the house. They love, it's typically for small gifts. But again, this has nothing to do with Christianity at all. This comes from ancient rural traditions of Spain around wood, around fire, and around sharing gifts. Christmas never forbade or removed this tradition. It absorbed it, and it created a part of the Spanish tradition of Christmas in the form of the cagatío. So now let's travel somewhere else. The US. In the US, you have this very funny celebration, which I'm honoring today, of the ugly Christmas sweater, in my case from the movie Gremlins of the 80s. I want to tell you all about this tradition, which is really, really funny. Where does these horrible but fun Christmas sweaters come from? Well, originally, these sweaters were sincere. Remember, in winter, it's more dark, so in the 50s and the 60s, actually people wore sweaters with bright colors during the winter to compensate the darkness of the winter. So that was the beginning of this tradition. But then mass production arrived, and with mass production, of course, you could mass produce this kind of sweaters, and they became louder and louder every year. And that's where American sitcoms stepped in. Shows like Family Ties, Full House, The Bill Cosby Show, and Seinfeld, they began doing episodes, and in some of those episodes, Christmas was happening. And of course, one very comical resource that they could use was the Christmas sweater. You know, the father of the family wore this really ugly sweater that they got as a gift for Christmas, and the kids of the family cringed, and the sweater became a running joke, a symbol of the awkward family warmth that we associate with Christmas. But the fun thing here is that, you know, people from the US, whenever there's some sort of social phenomenon, they want to jump in and be part of that phenomenon. And so real people actually began wearing those ugly sweaters on purpose. So the tradition that started on sitcoms actually crossed over into reality, and basically people began wearing those really ugly sweaters, and every year they're a little bit worse, and they began wearing them ironically, then competitively, and that is how the Christmas sweater tradition was born. But again, if you want to see wacky traditions around Christmas, I'm gonna go to a non-Christian country, in this case, Japan. It's a really fun story here, which is, again, as you're aware, Japan is not a Christian country. But I worked for Sony for 10 years, and when I was in Tokyo during Christmas, they were celebrating Christmas, you know, and there's lights in the street, and, you know, people give gifts, and all the usual stuff with the Christmas trees, etc., etc. But there was one tradition that struck me in a really ironic way, and I had to ask, hey, what is this all about? Which is the tradition to actually go to KFC on Christmas Day, and that's a true story, by the way. In Japan, Christmas dinner on the Christmas Day should be at KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, for many, many families. And this comes from a 70s advertisement campaign. You know, back in the day, of course, food companies were doing marketing across the world. And in this case, KFC did a campaign based around Christmas in the 70s in Japan. And you know what? That campaign worked, and it clicked with the people. And because it worked, it became a tradition, and now lots of families try to go to KFC either during Christmas or around Christmas Day. So I hope you're seeing the pattern, which is Christmas doesn't absorb traditions randomly. What it does is absorbs everything that aligns with its core values, which are the sense of togetherness, warmth, generosity. And so anything that generates closeness in the darkest times of the year gets pulled into this kind of like whole Christmas experience. A wood log that brings families together? Sure, why not? Ridiculous sweaters that make everybody laugh in a cute way? Sure, bring it on. And a shared meal, even if it's a fried chicken and a KFC? Yeah, sure. So it's different cultures, different symbols, but the same emotional function. Christmas doesn't ask where a tradition comes from. What it asks is, how does it make people feel? If the feeling is the right feeling for Christmas, those traditions are sucked into a bigger Christmas experience. So after everything we've seen, I think we can finally understand what Christmas really is. It's a celebration of humanity with two very clear layers. One layer is religious. For Christians, Christmas celebrates the birth of Jesus Christ around 2,000 years ago. And that meaning is real and it matters. Nothing in this video should take away the religious meaning of Christmas for believers. Remember, there's over 2 billion Christian people in the world. But there's a second layer, and this one is broader. It's a cultural layer that reaches Christians and non-Christian people alike. The ritual, the lights, the trees, the gifts, the feeling of warmth and togetherness. And this second layer does not belong to one religion. And I know this because I've seen it. Because of my work, I've worked in Japan, in China, I've worked in Dubai in the winter. And these are very, very different countries with different religions. But wherever you go, you see the spirit of Christmas and the Christmas tree and the gifts. The spirit of Christmas crosses borders and crosses religions. You can see lights in the street, people giving gifts, families and couples getting together, and they're not celebrating theology, they're celebrating something very universal, which is that in the dark, in the cold months, we want to be together, we want to say, I love you, and we want to share hope for the future. Because as you've seen, this is not about history, this is about psychology. Winter used to be a real threat, not metaphorically, literally. Cold meant death, darkness meant danger, scarcity meant anxiety, so humans evolved a strange need in winter to create signals of safety. And Christmas is full of them. Light is the most obvious one. In the darkest season, we manufacture daylight. Candles, fires, lights in the streets. It's not decoration, it's a message to your nervous system that you are safe. Feasting is another signal. When food was scarce, sharing that food meant you're not alone, the group has you. Gift giving, as the third component, is a social enabler. It's not about object, it's about bonds. A gift says, I care about you. And then there's the most important ingredient of all the Christmas experience, which is togetherness. Because isolation in winter has always been dangerous. Even today, we feel it in our mood, our sleep, our anxiety. So Christmas, at its core, achieves one goal. It turns the hardest season of the year into warmth, meaning, and connection. And that's why Christmas survives. In these 2,000 years, empires rose and fell, religions split, ideologies came and went, but Christmas didn't disappear, it actually grew. We often think of Christmas just as a Christmas tradition, but as we've seen today, it's so much more than that. It's part of our human culture, because at the end of the day, remember, we're just monkeys that came down from a tree, and we've come a long way as a species and a civilization, but when darkness comes, we still do the same thing we did back in the day. We gather, we stay close, we sit near a fire, and we wait for the light to return. For some, that light means God. For some others, it's hope for a better tomorrow. And then for some others, it's just waiting for the sun to come back in the summer. Different reasons, but the same need. So, whatever you are, whatever you believe, and however you celebrate, if you're using these days to be closer to the people you love, you are part of the Christmas story. So, from me and from everyone at DECODE, Merry Christmas. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, share it with your friends so that we can spread the joy of Christmas. And if you can do me a favor, of course, press like, hype, and ideally subscribe so that we can keep growing. And that's the best Christmas gift for me. See you on the next episode of DECODE. Bye.